Thank you for being with us. My name is Andrew Sims. I work with Robbie and Veronica and several others in running the Badvertising campaign. I run a think tank called the New Weather Institute, which runs the Badvertising campaign. Also involved in an organisation called the Rapid Transition Alliance. So one of the things which came up earlier, posing the question about what does this better world look like? Well, if you all hop on to rapidtransition.org, you'll see loads of examples, real world examples of where people are already making the kind of changes that we're talking about. But we're here to talk about an unusual combination. I tend to be a bit of a sports nut, but I'm also a bit of a climate nerd. And I have this kind of weird experience that when I'm with my sports mates and I talk about climate change, they give me this really strange look. And when I'm with my climate mates and I bang on about sport, I get the same look. Fish out of water. But here you have a very unique panel of people who, how can I put it? They give a shit about both. And we're going to be exploring how these things come together and why it's important. So welcome to Sportswashing, how to beat fossil fuel sponsorship in sport. And we're going to be hearing from Katie Cross, from Pledgeball, Robert Noyes, from Kick Fossil Fuels Out of Football, and Richard Holmes from Planet Super League. And why is this an issue? Well, sport is big, really big. There are at least 5 events that claim to have viewing figures above 2 billion. And we know climate change is touching every aspect of human life, and sport is no exception. In 2019, the Rugby World Cup was disrupted by unprecedented Pacific typhoons. In early 2020, the Australian Tennis Open met disarray due to smoke blowing in from the country's devastating bushfires. Last year, ironically, the Australian Tennis Open was sponsored by a fossil fuel company, an airline, and a car company. So in many ways, wherever you look, sport is floating on a sort of sea of fossil fuel money. And the Tokyo 2020 Olympics, delayed Olympics, were forced to move their long-distance running events north of the capital because of the city's sweltering summer weather. And, we've seen experiences of sports people at the top level having extreme health problems at the height of playing their games. In 2017, the cricket test match between India and Sri Lanka in Delhi was halted due to air pollution. And as we speak now, 2 great cricketing nations, Pakistan and India, are in the grip of a record-breaking, extreme and lethal heat wave affecting about 1.5 billion people, which has been described as living in hell. Now, I'm old enough to remember when I was a kid, I used to go and watch cricket in Essex, in Chelmsford, where I grew up. And I used to sit in the stands as an 11-year-old, watching a competition that was sponsored by Benson and Hedges, the Benson and Hedges Cup. It wasn't considered strange in those days to have a sport that was marketing itself to children sponsored by a cigarette company. Now, after a long and hard-fought battle in which the tobacco industry fought tooth and nail to avoid restrictions on its advertising, that was finally successful in this country in about 2005. And we look back at those days wondering how they were ever allowed in the first place. But now we face an even bigger systemic threat from climate change and the nature emergency, the mass extinction event going on all around us. And we're told by that wild radical figure, the Secretary General of the United Nations, that inaction, as demonstrated by governments at the moment, is criminal, and that delay means death. So all around us, we can see the impacts of global heating on sport and athletes. We can see the direct impact of sport on the problem, its emissions from energy and transport, and those of the legions of supporters who travel around the world after their teams. If anybody watched the Euros last year, you would have seen a competition that seemed almost designed to maximize the amount of climate pollution, as it was set in 11 countries. The Swiss team, had it played to its expected form, would have involved its supporters traveling 20,000 kilometers to watch all their games. But there's possibly a bigger impact still, and that's what we're going to be talking about a little bit today. And that's the influence of the messages that sport sends to its huge global audience, because we can see examples. My favorite, I'm not going to mention more than maybe a couple, but my favorite was the Manchester City promotion not very long ago, when it was offering as an inducement to get people to recycle their plastics, the opportunity to win air miles so that you could go on a long haul flight. UEFA, the football, the European football outfit, up until Russia invaded the Ukraine, had Gazprom as a major sponsor. It took a war to get them to drop them as a sponsor. But just as they did that, FIFA decided to take sponsorship from Qatar Energy. So we have a problem. And to unpick that problem and to see what we can do about it, we have our fantastic panel. And we're going to start with Katie Cross from Pledge Ball, leading a lifestyle revolution at the grassroots of football. Katie, over to you.
Thank you very much. And to echo Andrew, thanks very much for coming in on such a lovely sunny day. As Andrew said, it's the potential that football has to reach a whole audience, and not just reach them, but engage them and shift the relationship that they have with climate change that is really valuable. So I am going to mention Pledge Ball in a minute, because our aim is to engage these people who aren't engaged with climate change, who feel this real despair in the face of this overwhelming problem. And I'll explain how we do that and the research that backs it up. But just to explain the need for this to start with. So it's kind of the flip side of the coin. You know, the advertising, the fossil fuel advertising has a really detrimental impact. It reaches this huge audience. Now, if we flip that around and start shifting those messages, the potential is really quite unique. The IPCC report in February said that between 40 to 70% of carbon emissions could be slashed by supporting behaviour and lifestyle change. But if we are going to get behaviour and lifestyle change, we need a multi-pronged approach. We need the structures that support people with those lifestyle changes, removing the barriers to people making these changes. But we also need the individual agency. We need those people deciding that they are going to make those changes and questioning what they're buying, questioning who they're supporting, carrying this carbon currency with them in their daily lives so that every decision is influenced by the impact they're having on the planet. But how do we drive that change? Now, research also shows that it isn't necessarily a lack of awareness that stops people from acting. You know, we know that people want climate action to happen. They want change. Research consistently shows it's around 80% of people who want climate action to be taken. 86% of football fans in one particular study, specifically football fans, want their clubs to take climate action. But that isn't visible. There's a big attitude behaviour gap. So what we need to do is to shift, as I said, this relationship with climate change. We need to shift the paralysis that the majority of people feel in the face of such an overwhelming problem. That feeling that as an individual, they have no control. But they do have control, and we need to make that visible. And this is what we do at Pledge Ball. So we work with stakeholders across the football community to essentially mobilise football fans. And it is primarily football fans, I must add. There is a facility that is flexible to be used in other sports and even outside that. But we primarily focus on football fans. And I'll come on to why in a minute. What we do is, very simply, we ask fans to make pledges in support of their clubs. Now, this is integrated into match day. So all of the fixtures are automatically appearing on the website. On match day, we ask fans to compete off the pitch whilst the players compete on the pitch by making these pledges. And these range from using a reusable cup to going vegan 2 days a week, all the way up to installing solar panels. And I know there'll be questions around this, and I promise I'll probably answer them in a second, but if there are more, definitely ask them. When somebody pledges, it feeds back to them what quantity of emissions they will save over the course of the year by carrying those out, and what that equates to in terms of how many cars it equates to taking off the road to try and make it tangible. But more importantly, it tallies the individual's pledged savings alongside that of fellow fans. So the team of fans who pledges to save the most emissions wins the fixture. That tally bar you can see up there on the fixture moves depending on which team of fans in the lead, and it moves in real time. So fans can pledge in the lead up to the game, during the game, and right up until midnight on match day. A really simple process with a really low barrier to entry that is integrated into something with which fans already emotionally engage. It then also determines where they fall within the pledgeable league table. A really easy process. And again, I'll come on to why we know it works in a minute. But this is just helps you to visualize it a bit. So two of our clubs there, our partner clubs, have got Bristol City and Birmingham City. So this was a pledgeable derby on match day at home at Bristol City, Ashton Gate there. They encouraged their fans in the lead up to pledge. They offered an incentive. So every fan who pledged had the chance to win signed merchandise. And at half-time, they displayed the scores, and fans could pledge there and there using the QR code. So they could see that score moving in real time. That social media post there is from one of the Liverpool women's supporters clubs from another game. And this was another pledgeable derby. And the reason I show this is because we work with the Football Supporters Association. And for those who don't know, this is the biggest supporters association in the UK, made of currently 600,000 members, and they have representatives from football clubs across the country. We are working with them to essentially encourage them and support them to advocate for pledgeable and therefore climate action. And what is really crucial here is that they are embedded within their own communities. So we were lucky enough to work with a group of researchers called Climate Outreach, and a quote of theirs, which I absolutely love, is that if we're going to get this transformational change, we need peer-to-peer engagement. We need messages that speak to underlying core values, and we need credible messengers carrying those messages. And if you have fans already embedded within the community who understand the barriers facing people locally, then you're going to start to see change. And this is where true transformational change can be driven. Now, as I said, it's a very easy process, and the main question that normally comes up is, well, how the hell do you know it works? It's so easy for people to do. People could just cheat. Of course they could cheat. I mean, the whole point is that you are engaging people. Now, I did have that same question when we first started out. So we had a piece of academic research carried out when we launched our pilot club. And what this came back with showing was so the research looked at the potential for mobilizing football fans around climate change, but also how fans experience pledgeable at this pilot club. Now, football fandom ticks off all the markers of success for transformational change: collective efficacy beliefs, social norms, group-based emotion. Not only that, but it also has the fact that fans are really tribalistic. They want their team to win. And you're going to see people following and supporting just simply to support their team. You've also got this emotional engagement and the fact that people emotionally identify with their teams. So all of these are markers for success. Now, what we found when people engaged with Pledgeable was that people found, and I quote, that they gained an instant raised consciousness. Through engaging with the pledge list and seeing this huge list of pledges, which seems too many, but actually because they engaged with it and they enjoyed engaging with it because they saw things on there that they were already doing, they saw things they could work towards, and they saw things that they could maybe work towards in the future, they enjoyed going down and ticking them off and seeing which ones had the most impact. But also, because they saw this, they saw things alongside the pledging. So when one interviewee gave the example of having pledged to take 5-minute showers, but had seen the pledge to reduce his meat consumption, and that had then influenced how he'd gone shopping. It also made them, and again I quote, somehow more optimistic and confident because they could see that they were part of this group taking action, and not just their fellow fans, but fans across the country. They also came back and said that it then made them more likely to engage with material around climate change. So whereas before they experienced this real cognitive dissonance when it came to newspaper articles, for example, or voting leaflets around climate change, they just turn off because it was too frightening and too overwhelming, they then start engaging with this. And this is where that individual change starts to feed into the systemic. So to round off before I hand back to Andrew, I'm just going to give you a couple of stats that just demonstrate to you the potential power of this, and even on a surface level of directly reducing carbon emissions. So Bristol City, I'll use this stat because I remember it really well. Their home stadium has a capacity of 27,000. 27,000 fans, simply reducing shower time to 5 minutes, saves the same amount of emissions as taking over 2,000 cars off the road. Now, even that initially is quite empowering for fans. I mean, there's a big game happening at Wembley today. 1 Wembley's worth of fans simply turning off all sleeping appliances at the wall also equates to taking over 2,400 cars off the road, I think it is. So the potential for harnessing football fans and driving a potential social movement is absolutely huge. And this is where we need to be really questioning the advertisement, the messages that go on through football.
Fantastic. Fantastic. And to emphasize that cultural power that sport has, I think my favorite statistic from the last 12 months was the occasion that when Ronaldo was giving a press conference after a game. I don't know if you remember this, it was kind of reported on the news. It was clearly had been sponsored by Coke. But I don't know if you know about Ronaldo, he's a bit of a health nut. And when he sat down in his place, he took the Coke bottle and he removed it. And he said very earnestly to the journalists, he said, drink water instead. And he said it in a kind of, not in an English accent. And it wiped $4 billion off Coke's shares in an instant. So, it has a power. The other thing I should have mentioned is that our speakers today are part of organizations who are part of a kind of a loose coalition of groups called Cool Down, the Sport for Climate Action Network. And if anybody is involved in a sports club and wants to get involved or any kind of campaigns like that, please do get in touch with us. But now we're going to hear from Robert Noyes from Kick Fossil Fuels Out of Football. Now, I don't know if you ever use that as an acronym, but I just worked out that it spells KFF. And I wondered, is that meant to demonstrate the kicking of fossil fuels out of football?
Yeah, major part of it. Thank you so much for that. Hadn't realised that, so by the end of this talk we might have a new name, but hopefully not. I'm Rob. I'm here today to talk about a new fan-led campaign called Kick Fossil Fuels Out of Football. First, I'm going to run through some of the long relationship between fossil fuels and football around the world. Then I'll try to outline the scale of our challenge today, ending fossil fuel sponsorship, with a special focus on football. Lastly, the good bit, what can we do about it? How do we kick fossil fuels out of football? I'm also here today to meet Liverpool fans watching the FA Cup final, so if there's any here, I'll meet you outside later. Right, sorry, I'm on the wrong slide. Football is first. When preparing for today's event, I came across this wonderful statement by the late Mexican philosopher Carlos Monsiváis. It guides our campaign to kick fossil fuels out of football by reminding us to start with the fans, to start with the communal joy of the thing I, they, and some of you perhaps love. But it also reminds us not to stop there, to dive into the craziness surrounding this global behemoth, understand its impact on the world stage, the murky influences that drive its growth as a spectacle, and to face head-on the challenge of recapturing this beautiful game. In early spring this year, sportswashing hit the news in a big way, as the Western world responded to Russia's imperial war. For Europe, football was to become the latest arena for waging economic war. As the war carried on, it became clear that oil and gas play a key role in this brutal battle. And that means football too is implicated, for football and fossil fuels are intertwined intimately. This is not unique. The twist in the economic war, in which the governments of the West turn on the oligarchs of Russia, only serves to reveal the long marriage of oil and football since the early 1930s. As you may know, this November the World Cup is to be hosted by Qatar, the richest state per capita on Earth, as a result of it accounting for 13% of global gas reserves. Qatar is the largest liquid natural gas exporter in the world. What you might not know is the role Qatar plays in the UK government's energy strategy. The Qatar Petroleum Company, for example, owns the majority of the South Hook Terminal LNG, liquid natural gas, in Milford Haven in Wales, feeding gas onto the UK grid. South Hook is the largest LNG plant in Europe, and the UK's apparent fallback as the embargo on LNG from Russia is imposed. Fittingly, football was actually introduced to Qatar by British workers working for the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, now known as BP. The imperial boomerang has well and truly spun back around. Over the following 70 years, football, fossil fuels became ever more entwined. Manchester City, Nice, Newcastle, and PSG, to name but a few, are all owned by oil money. Qatar follows the African Cup of Nations, sponsored by Total since 2016, and the World Cup in Russia in 2018, after which the president of FIFA, Gianni Infantino, infamously received the prestigious Order of Friendship from Vladimir Putin. This close relationship now extends beyond oil companies to include the banks that finance oil projects and thereby drive forward climate chaos, cutting sponsorship deals. These include Barclays Bank, sponsoring the Premier League, and Standard Chartered, sponsoring my club, Liverpool. They choose football for a reason. Thanks for bearing with me on that whistle-stop tour, by the way. I thought it'd be useful to our discussion to understand the symbiotic relationship between global domination of football and fossil capital. By understanding it, we can begin to unpick it. Before we discuss what to do about it, there's still something important. Why do oil companies and their funders pick football? And why do football clubs let them? For both, the answers are actually pretty simple. Money and audience. The money involved for clubs is staggering. I don't have time to focus on it, but there's just one statistic I wanted to go to. Since I was born in 1994, the commercial income for Manchester United has increased by over 13,000%. For sponsors, the answer is audience reach. There's really nothing like football. To take the 2014 World Cup as an example, 3.2 billion people, more than half of the adults in the world, watched some of the tournament. More than 1 billion watched the final game. The final generated over 1 million tweets a minute. At the time, that was Twitter's busiest ever day. On Facebook, the first week of the World Cup generated more than 450 million exchanges. In 2014, this was more than the Winter Olympics, the Super Bowl, and the Oscars combined. Crucially, this audience is global. To take my club's sponsor, Standard Chartered, as an example, though they're a London-based bank, they operate primarily in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. For reference, the £30 million a year sponsorship deal with the club is dwarfed by the 1.3 billion they gave to fossil fuel companies in 2017 alone. But don't worry if you don't know who they are. You're not supposed to. Standard Chartered know that far more people watch Liverpool play in Asia and Africa than in Europe and in the UK. Over 50% of all people in Indonesia, Vietnam, and Thailand watch the Premier League on TV, compared to just 36% in the UK. Standard Chartered aren't advertising to you. When Mo Salah scores, the camera focuses on the front of his shirt, exposing a global audience to Standard Chartered. So, what do we do about it? Well, first we learn from others. The last 2 decades have seen powerful campaigns to end the sponsorship of arts and science institutions by oil and gas companies. As an image above by BP or not BP illustrates, the last decade has seen oil sponsorship links broken at Tate, National Gallery, National Portrait Gallery, and a number of other organisations. And we organise. As football fans and climate campaigners, we need to come together to kick fossil fuels out of football. What that might look like is starting a campaign to get your club to commit to not accepting oil money, banning oil sponsorship, working with fan groups, supporters clubs, contact them around the world, especially in the areas most impacted by climate change. For example, in Liverpool, which is my club, we've started a new campaign called Fossil Free LFC, where we work with supporters clubs and people that go to the games, as well as supporter clubs abroad, to organise a coalition of people to go to the club and demand that the new sponsorship deal with Standard Chartered is not renewed. This, for example, is a photo from COP, where a number of the groups that we'd been working with came to Liverpool to speak to fans directly. We had over 500 people come to an event to hear these people, the Fridays for Future MAPA group from most impacted areas from climate change around the world, talk to them about why they wanted fans to start a campaign on Standard Chartered. You might also, perhaps, want to reply to your club sponsorship deals through your own art, as many of you have done, and there might be some people in the room that took part in the Liverpool ones, of which I'll just have a few slides now. Lastly, just to finish up with, we have Ben here, who is one of Kick Fossil Fuel's Out of Football on Twitter's biggest fans, which is great to have him here in person. If you want to get involved, just find out more we're just getting started. We launched just this year. So join us for now by following and messaging Kick Fossil Fuels on Twitter. Thank you very much.
Fantastic, Rob. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. That's a bravura wrap-up of exciting developments in the game. Now, we heard quite a lot there about the fossil fuel companies themselves and some of the banks who are behind the fossil fuel companies. But of course, fossil fuels don't just magically enter the atmosphere of their own accord. They enter it when we burn them. And one of the principal ways in which we burn them is through driving and flying. And in terms of sports sponsorship, it's the big airlines and it's the car makers who are some of the most dominant sponsors in the sport. We did a survey in a report called Sweat Not Oil last year, and it revealed that Toyota and Emirates were the two biggest sponsors in terms of numbers of deals in the global sporting arena. And the interesting things about that are that the chief executive of Emirates recently went on record talking about the opportunities, the chances for decarbonising aviation, and said if you think anything radical is going to happen, then you're living in La La Land. Now, Toyota tries to make a big deal about its sustainability, and you might be surprised to learn that of all car makers, they do not even have a fully electric vehicle for general sale at the moment, and have been caught trying to undermine and slow down legislation to encourage electrification of vehicle fleets in the United States. In terms of the role of advertising in aviation and car making, we also did a piece of work with Greenpeace in which we looked at the additional emissions that result as a consequence of advertising increasing demand for cars and flights. And the scale is somewhere between the annual emissions of the whole of the Netherlands or twice the emissions of Spain. So the influence, the modelling, the lifestyle modelling that sport and sports clubs have is huge. And so Rich, I think, is going to talk to us a little bit about the influence that sport can have over the legions of people who follow it.
Thank you very much, and thank you for being here to listen to me for 10 minutes. Either that or you've started the presentation, regret it, and feel awkward to walk out the room. Either way, thank you. So I'm Rich from Planet Super League, and I am going to talk to you about football. More specifically, I'm going to talk to you about emissions and carbon emissions in football and how the approach from clubs and from leagues really needs to change if we want to have a positive and drastic impact. So I'm going to start with a really bit of basic psychology. As humans, we're mostly social animals, and our behaviours and our actions are kind of complicated patterns of imitation and influence. So people influence us and we imitate them. We influence other people and they imitate us. And this is often subconscious. We're not aware of it happening. It is how ideas and behaviours spread, and it can kind of glue parts of society together. It's a really powerful thing. So just as an example, your taste in music or your fashion sense was probably shaped at some time in your mid-teen years by your friendship group. What you next watch on Netflix will probably be a recommendation from a friend or someone you spoke to at work, or you might just go to the other people are watching section. It's all about influence. And it's a massive thing. It's how we operate as humans in a society, and businesses know this. And they use it to their advantage. They use it to get us to buy things. So, look, here's your favourite celebrity buying our product. You should buy it too. This happens all the time. And this can have a massive impact on our emissions as consumers, this advertising. So organisations, companies, football clubs, they talk a lot about reducing their emissions. And they talk about Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3. So Scope 1 is their direct operations. Scope 2 is things like their energy. And Scope 3 is their supply chain. And I'm going to use the word scope quite a lot, so I apologise in advance for that. None of these emissions cover the impact of influence that a company has over the people that follow it. So things like advertising, whatever it might be, none of those emissions are included in their reporting. And this emissions of influence concept, it's quite vague. It was termed Scope X by an organisation called Futura. And these Scope X emissions that a company influence their followers, their consumers, their fans, whatever you want to term it, can be absolutely astronomical, especially in an ad-rich environment like football, which I'm going to come on to in a second. And they can often outweigh the company's entire Scope 1, 2, and 3 footprint through influence alone. Scope X it's quite a new idea. It's very challenging to calculate. There's a lot of crossover, and because of that, it might limit how often it's used as a kind of term. But there's no denying that it is quite a big idea. So we're going to go back to football, and the patterns are very similar. So football clubs are like small organisations when it comes to their Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. And to make this easier, so I don't have to keep saying 1, 2, and 3, I'm going to group the 3 of them together, and I'm going to call it Scope C for club. Okay, it's not an official terminology, but I'm going to use it anyway, so bear with me. Now, a typical Premier League football club might have a carbon footprint in Scope C of around 10,000 tonnes. Smaller clubs might be in the low thousands, possibly even the hundreds. And these clubs will reach hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions of fans with their influence. And as a brand, they carry messages from sponsors, from advertisers, from corporate partners all the time. On their shirts, on their sleeves, in the stadium, on the stand, on the burger van outside, wherever it is, it's everywhere. And if we estimate that the combined Premier League club emissions, so there's 20 clubs in the Premier League, we said 10,000 tonnes, you're looking at around 200,000 tonnes a year, and that's on that Scope C concept that I talked about. But their emissions of influence, so I previously said Scope X, that how they influence their fans. I'm going to go back to using the word fans instead of consumers. It could be absolutely astronomical. So 200,000 tonnes is approximately that Premier League footprint. That influence scope could be well into the millions of tonnes. And just because I've used the word scope a lot and I've changed some terminology, I'm going to change Scope X to Scope F for fans. So Scope C is club, Scope F is fans. So bear with me on that because I've said scope 44,000 times already. So the Scope C, just to recap, that's your Scope 1, 2, and 3. That's your operations, your supply chain, your energy, all that kind of stuff. The Scope F is the football club's influence over the fan base and on their consumption and things like that. So all of that's quite negative, and I'm going to try and spin it positively now. Because that's what we want to try and do. But what I just want to point out is somebody mentioned this earlier in a talk just before lunch, that football fans and their clubs, it's like an identity to people. And clubs don't just have an impact and an influence on fans on a match day. It goes far beyond that into their everyday lives. So that's why this is so important. So that's where we come in. So at Planning Super League, what we do is we run green competitions, green tournaments, where football fans represent their club. And in representing their club, they score goals for their club by completing green activities, green actions in their everyday lives. And as they do that, they score goals for their club climb the league table. And they win a trophy. And that trophy's been around the country. We've done 5 competitions so far. We've seen around 14,000 users take part and complete more than 100,000 green actions to score goals for their clubs. And as a result, we've saved around about 360 tonnes of CO2, and we kind of calculate that with every action that's taken. But I'm going to get a little bit more specific. I'm going to focus on a relatively small football club, Northampton Town, who currently sit 4th in League 2. Anyone who follows, a really, really exciting and just crazy end to the season for them, where they ended up dropping out of automatic promotion by a 7-goal victory by Bristol Rovers. Now, Northampton Town and their fan base have really, really engaged with this Scope F concept and the influence of the club on their actions. And we've seen 483 Northampton Town fans take part in the campaign. And those 483 fans have completed more than 12,000 activities, saving over 66 tonnes of CO2. If we look at Northampton's Scope C, so their 1, 2, and 3 emissions from operations, supply chain, etc., we estimate that to be around 500 tonnes. So we can already say that through that Scope F influence, Northampton have saved 10% of their annual Scope C emissions through that Scope F influence. And it's still really early days. So 483 fans isn't a massive amount for that football club. So as the engagement gets better from the football club or from ourselves and that number increases, let's say Northampton Town's average home attendance is about 5,000 people. They've got 85,000 Twitter followers. So let's say 5,000 Northampton Town fans get involved in this campaign. They could easily save that Scope F influence of their entire Scope C footprint. Very, very simply. And that's quite a small club. So let's scale that up a little bit and look at the Premier League. Around 10,000 tonnes, we said, for their emissions. 20 times that of Northampton Town's. But they haven't got an average attendance of 5,000 and 85,000 Twitter followers. You're talking millions of people, several millions of people, all over the world in some of their cases. So it's a much bigger scale. So yes, their carbon footprint, their Scope C emissions are a lot bigger, but their scope of influence is absolutely astronomical, the difference that they could make. So if they can get their fans through their influence, through their advertising, through their messaging to take climate action, the difference they could make is huge. And that's what we're trying to focus on. Now, I was going to bring up actually the Ronaldo example and just tie that in. So that $4 billion knocked off Coca-Cola's share price by one simple action in a press conference of saying, no thanks. Imagine if that power was used by somebody like Cristiano Ronaldo to get people to take climate action. His Scope F influence could probably almost cancel out his property and car portfolio, or at least try to. So just to wrap this up a little bit, the biggest impact a football club can have is to invest in its Scope F emissions, that emissions of impact, the emissions of influence, sorry. And as music to a football club's ears, if they were in the room today, it's a lot cheaper to do that than it is the current €80 per tonne in the European carbon markets. Scope C emissions of a club can only be reduced so much in the short term. By the way, I've just completely forgot that I had some slides. There's some photos of some Northampton towns doing things, and that was some of the things of them taking action. I just completely forgot to change the slides as I was talking. Got carried away. So the biggest impact they can make is to invest in that Scope F and that influence. It's absolutely huge. But the Scope C emissions will only reach about 10% of the fan base on a match day for the fans that are fortunate enough to be able to go to a game, afford to go to a game and actually attend it, and typically only a few times a year, unless they're a season ticket holder. But a Scope F emission can reach 100% of a football club's fan base, locally and on the other side of the planet, anytime they like. Very easily. So the potential impact is absolutely massive. There's one little caveat I've got to add, and that's that it's vital that clubs don't only focus on Scope F, because if they focus solely on what their fans are doing and not getting their own house in order, that's where accusations of greenwashing come in. Okay? So it's really important that they focus on getting their own house in order and then use that as kind of influence to get the fans to take action as well. So there's plenty of advertising in football's role in mediating the influence of sponsorship and advertising. And whilst football does struggle with the economic and the moral dilemmas posed, perhaps the best thing that the industry can do right now is focus on Scope F, focus on its influence. It could really be the start of a radical change that we're all looking for. Thank you.